So I want to thank Rangjung Yeshe Institute very much for inviting me here. I really love being here. This is a very, very special place. I'm sure all of you feel that. Kind of unique in the world. And of course, I want to thank all the faculty and staff here. I want to thank all of you for your sincere study here, which really takes a lot of commitment. And also, of course, want to thank Trigini Rinpoche, who created all this and thousands of or millions of other things. It makes it possible for all of us to be here and do what we're doing. So I'm going to plan to be here at the Shedra in the cafeteria for lunch each day. And if any students or faculty would like to join me for lunch, then I'd really welcome that for any input that you might be able to give me, that anything that I talk about might raise, or anything else you'd like to talk about. So I just have to give just a little bit of background, and then I'm going to get into it, okay? I've been involved in the study and practice of Tibetan Buddhism since 1978, and I've been in academic Buddhist studies. My main interest in academic Buddhist studies has been connections between practices of devotion, compassion, and wisdom. And please raise your hand if at any point you cannot hear me well. So devotion, compassion, and wisdom are my interests, connections between them. And I notice in the academic world that there's a lot of writing on wisdom, there's some writing on compassion, and there's very little on devotion. And I think that's kind of a huge problem, because I think devotion is absolutely foundational. What I mean by devotion is practices of deepening receptivity to the power of enlightenment, which involve often involve ritual practices and also meditation practices, deepening receptivity and being offered up. So offerings, prayers, so forth. I think they're just so important to the history of Buddhism, and given so little attention in academia, it kind of amazes me. So you'll hear implications of that throughout my talk, even though I may not use the word devotion again. I also do work in the academy in what's called comparative theology, which explores the possibility of interreligious learning with other faiths. And in recent years, I've also started working with scientists on applying aspects of Buddhist meditation theory and practice for secular training in sustainable compassion. So the reason I said all that is because my talk tonight is going to draw on pieces of all of that. You'll hear echoes of all different parts of that throughout the talk. Now, the past 11 years, I've been working with colleagues in Buddhist studies, psychology, comparative religion, and contemplative science to create a program for training in compassion that we're calling sustainable compassion training or innate compassion training, because we have an innate capacity for compassion. So the aim of this sustainable compassion training is to help address needs of 3 groups of people: people in caring roles and professions, Western Buddhists, probably like many of you, and people who practice in non-Buddhist spiritual traditions. So the training is for those 3 groups, which also intersect with each other. Many people in caring roles and professions would like to access the power of care and compassion that can be much more sustaining, replenishing, and inclusive than what they've been experiencing in their lives and work. Less subject to mental depletion, compassion fatigue, so-called, and burnout, and bias. So that's the first group. Was that clear? The second group is many Buddhists share that concern and also seek through their practices to become unified with the ultimate source of those loving capacities. The unimpeded openness and liberating wisdom and compassionate energy that's found in the depth of human awareness, which is the core of enlightenment. But even after years of practice, many Buddhists struggle more fully to realize that source of compassion and wisdom at the depth of their being or in the nature of their minds. So that's the second group. The third group is many people in other spiritual traditions who wish to learn not just intellectual ideas from Buddhism, but how its practices may inform and empower their spiritual lives, including their capacities for more unconditional love, compassion, and discernment. So the aim of sustainable compassion training as a method of understanding and practice is to help meet all three of those needs for all three of those intersecting groups. Is that clear enough so far? So for that purpose, in developing sustainable compassion training, so can I call that SCT now? SCT means sustainable compassion training. In developing it, my colleagues, the ones I've worked with, and I draw especially on Tibetan Buddhist understandings of awareness and its capacities for love, compassion, and wisdom, so seeking to make them newly accessible for people of diverse backgrounds and faiths. That's the aim. So it's a big challenge. So we draw on Tibetan Buddhism not only because it's the primary tradition of training for our core group, but also because of the precision and depth of experience in accessing capacities of love, compassion, and wisdom, and reunifying with their source in the depth of our awareness, and responding from there to others in their deep dignity and potential, beyond superficial impressions and reactions. There's a precision and depth to Tibetan Buddhist approaches to that. That is the reason we draw especially on Tibetan Buddhism and adapt practices from it. But the SCT meditation practices that are adapted from Tibetan Buddhism are also informed by analogous patterns of practice in other spiritual traditions. I'll mention that, including theistic and indigenous traditions. And also we draw on influential theories in developmental and social psychology, including, for those who are familiar with psychology, attachment theory, social baseline theory, internal family systems, and other areas of psychology. So in what follows, I'm going to discuss some of the issues involved and introduce one of the relevant meditations, okay? So introducing a meditation isn't going to freak you out, is it? It should be okay here. But I actually do this also at universities and colleges in the United States where I'm invited, including state universities that are entirely secular. Sort of, okay, let's do a meditation exercise. And it's doable. There are ways that you can introduce it that it can make sense in any context, I think. Almost any context. So first of all, I need to talk a little bit about evolutionary issues that have to do with the innate nature of compassion from evolution, from an evolutionary perspective. So when you're listening, you can be understanding what I'm doing as trying to frame things in a way that's bringing in science, but drawing primarily on Buddhism, so as to include all three kinds of audiences that I just described. So in a way, you can be listening as if all three kinds of audience were here, although in this room, it may only be that one or two of those kinds of audiences are here, probably two at least, people in caring roles and professions and Buddhists. But there may also be people of other faith traditions here, right? So just think about that. I'm trying to include the whole room. So as human beings, and also people who are non-religious, but are brought up within a scientific worldview, which we all are in the West now, and in most urbanized areas of the world. So as human beings, we have a tremendous underlying capacity for care and compassion that derives from evolution. Capacities for care, empathy, nurturing, social bonding, compassion, and cooperation that are essential to our survival as a species. I mean, it used to be thought not too long ago, when bringing up evolutionary theory, that the main thing that evolution meant with human beings was the power of competitive aggression and violence. And that through competitive aggression and violence, our species won out over all the other species and became dominant. But most evolutionary theorists now don't actually think that that's the most important factor at all. The most important factor in how our species became dominant on Earth is through evolution, our capacity, our particular species, for social bonding and cooperation and mutual care. So humans are actually physically much weaker than many other species. So how is it that we became the dominant species on Earth? As I just said, many evolutionary theorists now agree that we became the dominant species primarily through our superior capacities for cooperation and social bonding, the ability to accomplish things together with shared goals. This is a crucial factor in our evolution. And this also means that these capacities of care, connection, bonding, empathy, and compassion are innate from an evolutionary perspective, not only from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective. And this evolutionary perspective aligns with an emerging area of evolutionary and social psychology called social baseline theory that was pioneered by James Cone at University of Virginia, and I've worked with him a little bit. So according to social baseline theory, so bear with me, this is not going to be overly technical because I'm not overly technical, so it's all going to be quite understandable. But according to social baseline theory, the human brain is designed by evolution to function best within a social context of connection to others. Our brain is designed by evolution and expects to be in connection with others. If it is not in connection, if we are not in connection with others, mentally, physically, we are weakened. It goes against how our brain is designed by evolution. So the brain is energetically optimized when we experience ourselves in supportive social connection with others, and our brains get energetically depleted much more quickly when we experience ourselves as alone. Is that clear? I think this is being established through a lot of different research protocols that are going on now, especially by Jim Cone and others. So for example, in one research experiment, when a person with a heavy backpack is facing a high hill that he or she is going to have to climb, if that person is with a friend, the hill appears less steep than when standing alone. This has been measured. Or when a person undergoes an electric shock, sorry, but psychologists do things like that. When a person undergoes an electric shock, if that person is holding the hand of a friend, she feels less pain than when alone. These are examples of what social baseline theory has established. Our brain is optimized when we're in social connection. We're actually designed to be in social connection. You ever notice when you're alone at night, you start to feel afraid for no reason? So maybe it would be helpful to think of a field of refuge, and suddenly you feel safe. That accords with social baseline theory. You are out of social connection and you need to come back into it. And refuge field would be sort of highest optimized social connection, let's put it that way. Social baseline theory correlates with another area of social psychology, attachment theory. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on and on with this, but actually everything I'm referring to will come back when we get into spiritual practices, so I need to get into it a little bit more. So attachment theory really correlates with social baseline theory. Attachment theory in psychology asserts that in the course of our emotional maturation as human beings, the experience that we are loved is crucial to help us internally establish the secure base within ourselves that we need to become a loving presence to others. I'll repeat that. According to attachment theory and social psychology, which is extremely well established now, there's tons of research on it, the experience that we are loved is crucial to help us internally establish the secure base in ourselves that we need to become a loving presence to others. Humans are wired by evolution for connection, relationship, care, empathy, and compassion, to care for and to be cared for by others. But for many of us, there are significant limitations. I mean, this is obvious to us, significant limitations to how continuously and how inclusively we are able to draw on capacities of love and care and compassion in our lives and in serving others, right? Big limitations. We get worn out, or the direction of our care is quite focused and limited on our own in-group, for example, or on oneself. Those are huge limitations. We also become mentally and emotionally depleted. Let's say I'm getting burnt out, I'm just giving and giving and I'm not getting enough, I'm not receiving enough. This is typically how many of us often feel. Those are limitations on these capacities of love, care, and compassion. So I'm going to give a definition of compassion, a working definition that comes from Buddhism and also aligns quite well with areas of social psychology. So I'll say that compassion is a loving or caring concern for someone that empathizes with them in their suffering and wants to take action to alleviate it. Is that clear? So I'll repeat it. Compassion's a loving or caring concern for someone that empathizes with them in their suffering and wants to take action to alleviate it. That means empathy is part of the definition of compassion here. And empathy is the affective and cognitive ability to sense and imagine what it must be like for someone to undergo the suffering that they are experiencing. So a caring or loving concern for someone, when refracted through the lens of empathy, becomes compassion that wants to alleviate their suffering. You care about them, you want them to be well. Love is the wish for them to be deeply well. And then when you notice that they're suffering, you wish them to be free of the suffering so they can be well. So compassion is a form of love or care. Is that clear enough so far? However, there are some problems with our ordinary experience of empathy, which is at the heart of compassion. Some big problems raised by some modern psychologists and philosophers. Problems with empathy that tend to limit our capacity for compassion in huge ways. I'm going to point out two problems with the way we ordinarily experience empathy. And then I'll talk about how those problems are addressed by spiritual practices. The first problem is empathetic bias for our own community. So we have empathy for those in our own community, our own family or narrow in-group. We care a lot when they're suffering, but we don't have empathy like that for people in our out-group. Like when we're in a nation that's at war with another nation and bombs are falling on that other nation, we tend not to have the same reaction as if bombs were falling in my neighborhood. That's a major difference in our empathy for those in my neighborhood and those in that foreign country, isn't it? So that's empathetic bias. That's a huge limitation. And that supports prejudice and violence. Because I empathize so much with my own narrow community, for that very reason, in defense of my community, I will attack another community. So empathy actually is a major cause of violence itself. You see that these are pretty big problems with our ordinary experience of empathy. In fact, the ethnic and religious tensions and violence that we see around the world are fueled in large part by in-group empathy and out-group lack of empathy. Throughout Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Middle East, Europe, everywhere. Now there's a second problem with empathy. Do you want to hear it, or are you too depressed to hear the second problem? Okay. The second problem with empathy is empathic distress, which is this term in psychology. And that's when we get overwhelmed by the pain of our own empathy for others who are suffering. You ever experience that? Like you have empathy for others who are suffering, you really care. And if you really have empathy for them, that's painful. So repeated experience of the pain of our own empathy for others, repeated experience of empathic distress leads to increasing stress, emotional exhaustion, secondary trauma, and what's been called compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, which is the loss of motivation to empathize with. Like you just can't empathize anymore. It's too painful. So you lose the capacity to empathize or even to care about others. And this is very common in healthcare providers, therapists, psychiatrists, nurses, right? Social workers. It's a real affliction, empathic distress, leading to compassion fatigue. And these experiences then are associated with high rates of burnout in caregivers, like the ones I said, also teachers. And these difficulties are exacerbated when administrators and co-workers who are subject to the same kinds of empathic overwhelm and emotional exhaustion, administrators who organize your institution, co-create work environments that are uncaring, unsupportive, or overly demanding. And all that lack of care and lack of empathy becomes oppressive. And that leads to significant burnout in all kinds of workplaces. Is that clear so far? So we've got empathic bias and empathic distress. Those are pretty big problems, aren't they? So maybe we should just throw out our interest in empathy altogether because it's just such a big problem. And indeed, I know some of you were smiling as if that was a joke. Unfortunately, it's not. There is one prominent psychologist and some others who, for these very reasons, has rejected empathy as a virtue and says, argues basically that we need to have a cognitive understanding, kind of like an intellectual understanding of the things that others are going through, and that is good enough. But don't try to promote empathy because of these two problems. One psychologist at Yale has argued that, Paul Bloom. Paul Bloom, yeah. He actually has a little book out called Against Empathy. So it's fun to talk to him, though. I mean, ironically, he seems like a very caring person. I know. Yeah, it is, and we've had wonderful conversations, me and my colleagues, with him as well. And of course, I attack his positions, but he's so brilliant, though. I mean, the way these two problems, the way I just expressed them, wasn't that clear? A lot of that comes from Paul Bloom. He's so clear. But here's why I think he's wrong. And indeed, most psychologists, philosophers, and theologians see empathy as extremely important in both its affective and cognitive aspects. It's an essential part of compassion and compassionate action, and I agree with them that empathy is extremely important. We need to be able to sense and imagine what it must feel like for others to go through what they're experiencing, not just intellectually understand that they're going through something. We have to be able to sense and imagine what that must feel like, at least as best we can, in order to generate a strong enough motivation to take sustained action in ways that may sacrifice our own comfort or even risk ourselves on their behalf. I don't think lack of empathy will do that. Okay, so far? Okay, but now we have a problem. If we need empathy to have really genuine, strong compassion that takes action and might even risk yourself to take action for others, how are we to address these two problems? Empathic bias, empathy just for our in-group and not for the out-group. And the other is empathic distress that contributes to emotional depletion and burnout. So I'm going to first discuss the problem of bias, and then I'll talk about empathic distress a little bit, okay? So first, to treat the problem of bias. Do you want to treat that problem? Should we? What do the teachings say? No, bias is okay. Better to have love for our own in-group. Don't worry about those others. Who cares? Is that in your classes? So the problem of bias. We need ways to cultivate a power of loving concern and empathy to increasing inclusivity beyond our familiar in-group, out-group boundaries. So this involves empowering human capacities for more inclusive care, compassion, and discernment that have been held back by socialized habits of bias, perception, and reaction. I can say some more here from science on this, but I want to sort of move along. There is, just to say this, there is research that indicates that we're born with innate capacities for care and responsiveness and empathy that manifest in infancy and are quite strong and spontaneous. But as we mature, in-group bias becomes socialized fairly early on in our childhood. But at an earlier phase in infancy, natural empathy and care for others is almost automatic. Anyhow, the experience of Tibetan Buddhism, and that would be a sign that the capacity for empathy and care is innate again, right? So the experience of Tibetan Buddhism and other spiritual traditions, I want to draw on that for a moment, to access capacities for more inclusive, unconditional, and sustaining love and compassion and wisdom, a relational starting point has been assumed. That is, that contemplative and ritual practices to cultivate such a power of compassion begin not with yourself. So practice begins, so think about this, what I'm saying, and see if this matches what you're being taught and what you experience. Practice, including ritual and meditation practice, begins not with yourself trying to become more loving and compassionate just on your own. Think about that for a moment. Is that true? That's what I'm saying. I'm arguing that. All these practices, this is true within Buddhism, it's true in Tibetan Buddhism, and it's true in many other spiritual traditions, to cultivate a really sustaining, unconditional, inclusive power of compassion, care, wisdom. It does not begin with a sense of yourself on your own, trying to become more loving and compassionate just on your own. It begins with the awareness that you and your whole world are held in the love and the compassion and wisdom of a relational field, a whole field of loving connection. In indigenous religions, that's a field of ancestors and divinities. In Buddhism, it's a field of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Arhats. Does this sound familiar? How do you begin every practice? You don't begin with, here I am on my own doing a self-help technique. That is not how you begin as a Buddhist, nor how you begin in any other spiritual tradition I'm aware of. You begin by going for refuge, don't you? That's a big deal. Without that, I'm arguing everything's going to fail. If we make our practice in our minds into a self-help technique by an autonomous, isolated self who's going to improve myself by becoming more and more loving, we've already established in our minds a barrier to the possibility of truly sustaining and truly unconditional and inclusive love and compassion. There's already a barrier there by the framework that we're simply assuming. And those of us brought up in the West and in modern urbanized cultures almost automatically and unconsciously tend to assume that. Remember what social baseline theory said? The moment we feel ourselves to be alone, our brain is already much more quickly depleted than when we experience ourselves in social relational connection. The first thing we do in practice is bring to mind the field of refuge. Or, I'm arguing, we should. So you see how I'm trying to argue science can point out certain things that can help us take seriously aspects of our practice that we may not have realized we really have to take seriously. In theistic traditions, of course, the relational field, the field of loving connection, would be a relationship with God and fields of divine or saintly figures. To experience yourself and your whole world as held in unconditional compassion and wisdom empowers you to settle into the source of that compassion and wisdom in the depth of your being, and to extend the same power of love and compassion to many others. To experience yourself and your whole world held in a field of inclusive love and compassion, which is what is happening when you bring to mind the refuge field, becomes an empowerment ultimately for you to become incorporated into that spiritual field, to become an extension of it, to become part of that refuge field. And that ultimately, in our tradition, is why we take refuge. It's not just to rely on the field of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and on the teachings. It's to become incorporated into them, to become unified with them, to become an extension of them, ultimately to become an extension, to become a part of that refuge field for many others. That's the purpose. And that's why the practice of refuge precedes the generation of bodhicitta, because the ultimate purpose of refuge is bodhicitta, is to become a part of that field. And that's the commitment of the bodhisattva, that I vow to become part of that refuge field for many other beings, the very field that I'm taking refuge in. When you reread the Bodhicharyavatara, the Bodhisattva way of life from Shantideva, you'll see that really clearly in the first 3 chapters. It establishes the foundation for the whole rest of the text. And it astonishes me when I read most Western Buddhist studies of the Bodhisattva way of life, how little attention is paid to those first 3 chapters, how little interest. We'll just study chapters 8 and 9, as if you could actually realize what's being said in chapters 8 and 9 without the deep ritual and contemplative engagement with refuge and purification, offering, that are comprise the first 3 chapters. Anyhow, you understand what I'm saying? You don't have to agree, but so in Buddhism, from earliest Buddhism, one of the important practices is called Buddhanusmrti. It's like Sangye Jesu Drempa, or Sangha Anusmrti, Gendun Jesu Drempa. Also, Chu Jesu Drempa is a dharma. Buddhanusmrti, Sangha Anusmrti means literally the practice of recollecting, recalling, bringing to mind the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and vividly recalling their qualities. And importantly, and again, I think this is just not appreciated enough in the modern academy. This recollecting of the Buddha and the realized Sangha, it's not a dry intellectual exercise. When you read the text, they're listing qualities, unlimited compassion, these kinds of wisdom, these kinds of abilities. So it becomes like a list. So people sort of in the Buddhist studies world are like learning these lists. That's very interesting, and oh yes, I can imagine thinking about that list of things. But that is not mainly what's happening. It's clear from the commentaries on this practice, which is very foundational, from earliest Buddhism all the way to the present, like in all of our Tibetan practices, the recalling or bringing to mind of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as our field bearing witness, or our field of support in what we're doing, is a vivid recollection of their qualities as active powers, so that you experience you and your whole world as held by the powers that you're recalling and bringing to mind. Like the Buddha's all-pervasive wisdom and compassion. That means it's pervading you, it's holding you, it's blessing you. Your whole world is held in that, all beings are held in that. So what you're seeking as a practitioner, you are already held in. It is already here. So when we talk, for example, about Vajrayana as the path of taking the result, taking the fruit of the path, the result of the path as the path, simply to properly take refuge or properly recall the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas and their qualities, and to actually realize that you and your whole world are held in those qualities, not just intellectually going through a list in your mind, is already the beginning of what Vajrayana means. You're already experiencing the result, the power of the result, here now. And that is a power that's resonating with and already beginning to evoke your own capacity. Indeed, your experience of that power, that you are already held in the qualities of love and compassion and wisdom and so forth. To the extent that you actually experience that, what you're experiencing are qualities of your own awareness being evoked by that ritual practice. So that comes from earliest Buddhism, this practice of bringing the Buddha to mind and being freed from fear because you're under the protection of the power of the Buddha present to you. And that becomes very prominent in Mahayana sutras, in the tantras, and then in all Buddhist, all Tibetan practice traditions, like in Ngondro practice, in the ways I just described. So a similar pattern of practice is found in other spiritual traditions. The generation of inclusive compassion begins not with an isolated sense of self, taking up a self-help technique, but with the experience that you and your whole world are held in the care and compassion of a spiritual field that blesses you ultimately to become an extension of that field. In indigenous religions, that's a field of ancestors, also in Confucianism. In theistic traditions, it's a field of divine or saintly figures. In Buddhism, as I said, it's a field of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Arhats and so forth. Regarding the problem of bias in empathy and care, this is the pattern of practice in spiritual traditions that helps break down boundaries of in-group versus out-group. As you experience everyone in your whole world held in the same inclusive power of love that transcends all such bias, and learn to become an extension of that inclusive power. Now, of course, this is the ideal of these spiritual traditions. I'm not saying that people in general live up to that ideal or know how to practice it properly, but that is the ideal of each of these traditions. That bias would start to be broken down by the fact that you're experiencing your whole world in the care of absolutely unconditional, all-inclusive care of God, of the Buddha, of the field of ancestors. And this traditional pattern of spiritual practice also corresponds to a similar pattern that I've noted in areas of social psychology, attachment theory, and social baseline theory. Human beings have a fundamental need to experience loving connection in order to access our own capacities to love and care for others in increasingly reliable and inclusive ways. So is that clear so far? So that's the first problem of empathic bias. The second problem is empathic distress, being overwhelmed by our own pain of empathy for others repeatedly, leading to so-called compassion fatigue and burnout. So to avoid this problem, we need a safe way to become aware of our own painful feelings, including painful feelings of empathy. Is that clear? We need a way to become aware of our own painful feelings, including the pain of empathy itself, not avoiding the pain of empathy, able to experience the pain of empathy in a way that's safe and healing for us, that permits feelings to deeply settle and heal rather than to overwhelm us. We need a practice that helps us become a healing presence to our own feelings in order to become a healing presence to others and their feelings. In the spiritual traditions that I've mentioned, practitioners experience their whole being, including all of their painful feelings, to be held in the healing power of unconditional love and compassion. Rather than experiencing your own suffering contracting into a narrow sense of yourself, isolated in your own pain, you experience all of your feelings as embraced in a larger reality of warmth, acceptance, compassion, and wisdom that holds every part of yourself and your world. So it's holding not only your whole world externally, but your whole world internally. Every layer of feeling and thought and feeling and habituation is being held in the healing powers of love, compassion, and wisdom, every part of you. It's this that made Shantideva feel safe enough to recognize, become conscious of, and acknowledge his flaws as a human being in chapter 3 of the Bodhisattva Way of Life. This is what permitted him to do that. Otherwise, who could possibly become conscious of all of our flaws, many of which have been subconscious? Who would want to know? We would have to experience ourselves as held in a place of absolute safety to be able to consciously acknowledge the many negative, harmful ways of thinking and being and reacting that we've all been conditioned into. Watch for that when you go back and look at the Bodhisattva Way of Life. What gave Shantideva the courage to do that? Because that takes courage. It was the earlier chapters in relation to a field of absolute support from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. He's not doing this alone. And this larger power of love and compassion that holds all our feelings can also evoke our corresponding capacities for love and compassion from the depth of our being, which can extend to others, including others who are suffering. So rather than our painful feelings drawing us enclosed into ourselves in empathic distress and being overwhelmed by our own pain of empathy, our painful feelings are fueling a power of empathy, care, and compassion that extends outwards to others, and we're safe. Is that sort of clear? And does that sound a little bit familiar? So This traditional approach to avoiding empathic distress and empathic overwhelm aligns well with attachment theory, which I noted earlier. We need to become established in a secure enough base within the felt experience of love and compassion for us consistently to include others in love and compassion. That's attachment theory. And this pattern from spiritual traditions that I just described, and is extremely prominent in Tibetan Buddhism and in Shantideva. This also aligns with social baseline theory that I mentioned earlier. We're more energized when we experience ourselves as located in a social field of caring connection, and get much more rapidly emotionally and mentally depleted when we experience ourselves as isolated and alone. Is this all clear so far? So in sum, this pattern of understanding that human beings need to experience love and compassion to be able to extend love and compassion in a reliable and inclusive way is fundamental both to the various spiritual traditions and to what we know of the emotional psychological development of human beings. So it would make sense to draw on this pattern for training those who wish to cultivate a sustaining and inclusive power of compassion. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. However, so then comes the next problem. There are always problems, it's never just easy. This relational pattern, where relational, I mean you're held in a field of loving care and connection, and being held in that, you're empowered to settle more into the depth of your being from which you can extend that same care and compassion to others. That pattern, that relational pattern from Tibetan Buddhism and other spiritual traditions has involved ritual and contemplative practices that are specific to each tradition and culture. So the field of ancestors or of bodhisattvas or saints that are particular to your own community. Is that clear? You see the problem? So what do we do? You can't just, you have a workshop with 100 social workers. Okay, now envision Guru Rinpoche and the Buddhists and Bodhisattvas. That is not going to work at all. Yet, given everything that I just described, doesn't it seem like there should be something that could work, something that could be offered? So how can we adapt this relational pattern from spiritual traditions that are so particular to each culture into a more inclusive form that could be equally accessible to participants of any background? And not only for people who belong to one particular spiritual tradition, but for people from any tradition. And not only for religious people, but also for those who are not religious, including training for nurses and doctors and teachers and social workers and therapists and educators and so forth. So I think this can be done by noticing how a relational field of love and compassion is constructed in various spiritual cultures of Asia. This construction begins, so here, I know we've been going on for a little while, but I'm moving into conclusion and then leading a meditation exercise. So please listen to this part pretty closely because it's going to set up the meditation exercise, okay? This construction of a relational field of care and compassion begins by bringing to mind a caring figure who has been a deeply supportive presence to you or to your community. A caring figure, a figure of care, love, compassion, who holds you and your world in the qualities of love, care, compassion, and wisdom that he or she embodies. Is that clear? You bring to mind a figure like that. Obviously, for many of us, that would be the Buddha or our teacher. Arrayed around that figure, other figures are envisioned who have been a supportive presence to that first figure. So it's like lineage gurus who transmit their loving, compassionate power through him or her also to you. So by coming into repeated connection with that spiritual field of compassionate connection through ritual and contemplative means, then you're being empowered ultimately to become an extension of that field and to transmit the same loving power and support to others. So that's like a whole field of refuge, a field or a lineage tree where you have your own teacher and your teacher's teachers and their teachers and all the associated teachers, and it becomes quite big. So that's, well then, whatever your spiritual tradition or religion, you could do that. It doesn't have to be the Buddha. Bring to mind your spiritual figures. And what about people who are not religious? Well, I think an analogous kind of a field can be constructed that can help them, at least to some degree, access the great power of this kind of relational field as a foundation and support for the cultivation of care and compassion and wisdom. So we can construct an analogous relational field based on figures from our own lives, no matter what our background or tradition or worldview may be. We can recall and draw upon a moment or period in our own lives. So for a moment, for this next 2 minutes, forget, those of you who are Buddhist, forget you're Buddhist. Pretend that you're a nurse or a doctor or a social worker or a teacher, and you've come here to a workshop or a retreat, and it is certainly and absolutely not to be assumed that anybody is any one religion or has any interest in religion. Pretend that that's who you are, and that's what this room is right now, okay? Which might also include devout people who are religious as well, also. That's what's in the room. That's what's in the room when I talk about these things, typically. So now I would say to them, or to you as them, this is like an imagination exercise, okay? You're not Buddhist. You don't care about religion, or you're a Catholic, or whatever you are, okay? So we can construct an analogous relational field. We can recall and draw upon a moment or period in our own lives when we were seen and held in a power of care. Try to do that. Forget for a moment that you're a Buddhist. Try to recall a moment or period in your life when you were seen and held in a power of care. Think of someone that you are grateful has been in your life or in your world. Someone that you are grateful exists or has existed. Who you feel has inspired you or blessed you by their presence or their way of being or their mentorship, or inspired you from afar. Can you do that? Or it could be someone in your life by whom you felt seen or heard at a given moment, or whose way of being was uplifting for you, or who you sensed was rooting for you, or wishing you well at some point. Try to think of someone like that. Someone you're grateful has been in your life or in your world. Can you do that? Try. And envision that person before you. And then if you wish, just if you wish, you can also think of those who inspired and blessed that person. Just think that they're also there with her or him. And that's your spiritual field for this practice. Okay, so I've instructed you what to do at the right time. So let's just do first enter into meditation with a little bit of abdominal breathing. So just sit in a relaxed, straight back way. When you inhale with abdominal breathing, your abdomen, your tummy should expand on the inhale. Can you feel it expand when you're inhaling? Please do. And then the exhale is relaxed, slow, and complete. So inhaling, tummy expands. And then slow, relaxing exhale. You pause for a moment at the end of the exhale, and then you begin again. Tummy expanding on each inhale. Slow exhale. Pause for a moment. And then inhale again. And now, while continuing to breathe from the abdomen, just let the breath settle into its own natural rhythm. So your tummy still expands on the inhale each time, but it's just natural rhythm. And now bring to mind that your spiritual field, which here would be that person for whom you're grateful, has been in your life or your world. And if you wish, the others who have also blessed and inspired her or him. And bring them to mind as powerfully present to you here and now. Not just thinking of them at a distance, but they are here with you. Powerfully present to you now. Perhaps just as they were at a given moment in your life. That's happening here now. And sense or imagine that they are seeing you in your deep dignity and worth and potential beyond all judgments. And just holding you and your world in deep love and compassion and care and wisdom. And just wishing you deeply well and free. And relax into the felt sense of this field of care and love and compassion. Just steeping in its loving energy and tender qualities. Letting this loving energy and compassionate qualities just infuse your whole being. Letting this loving energy and its qualities infuse your whole body and every part of your heart and mind, every thought and feeling encompassed in this power of love and compassion. Every part of you loved in its very being. Just accepting it. And now just settle deeply into this felt sense of love or warmth or acceptance, and let this help your heart and mind to relax deeply, to release all frameworks of mind, and to just fall gently, completely open like space. Let your heart and mind just fall gently, completely open like space. And let the patterns of thought and feeling that arise just unwind or release within this utter openness of awareness, this space of deep acceptance, letting all be. Just letting all be. Okay. So you can let the atmosphere of the practice continue to resonate into what we do next. So then I'll just kind of conclude. So again, what is the pattern of practice from Tibetan Buddhism and other traditions that we explored in this meditation exercise? It's okay, by the way, if Chugani Rinpoche came up, even though I told you forget that you're a Buddhist for a moment, but that might be someone you're grateful to. At the same time, I'm not assigning that, am I? Whatever your worldview, whatever your life, whatever comes to you, that could be your access point to these capacities of the nature of our mind. So what's the pattern of practice that we just engaged from receptivity to inclusivity? When we experience what it's like to be held in love and compassion, it can help us settle into the source of that love in the depth of our being, from which to extend the same power of love and compassion to others, beyond in-group bias and beyond tendencies of empathic distress or compassion fatigue. So summing up the key points of this whole talk quickly, empathy is a crucial aspect of compassion. But as we ordinarily experience it, empathy can also present barriers to a much more inclusive and sustaining power of compassion, such as in-group bias and tendencies for empathic distress and mental depletion. So in my work with others, we've been exploring if such barriers to compassion can be addressed, in part by forms of practice adapted from Tibetan Buddhism, which are informed by relational practices also of other spiritual traditions, and by relational theories of social and developmental psychology, like attachment theory and social baseline theory. My hope is that such forms of practice may contribute to a more inclusive and sustaining power of care and compassion for all three target groups that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. The three target groups are people in all kinds of caring roles and professions who want to access a power of compassion that could be much more sustaining, replenishing, and inclusive than what they've been experiencing. The second target group is Buddhists, modern Buddhists perhaps, who share that same concern and also seek through practice to become unified with the ultimate ground or source of those loving capacities, which is the unimpeded openness, liberating wisdom, and compassionate energy that's found in the depth of our awareness, or Buddha nature, or the nature of our mind. The third target group is people in other spiritual traditions who wish to learn not just intellectual ideas from Buddhism, but how its practices might inform and empower their spiritual lives, including their capacities for more unconditional love, compassion, and discernment. So the aim of sustainable compassion training, the first meditation exercise of which we just entered into, is to try to help meet all three of those needs. I probably can't perfectly meet all those needs, but to begin to help meet all three of those needs for all three of those intersecting groups. I'll leave you with just one quick story. It's like literally a 30-second story, so don't panic. When I presented these very ideas at the university, a university in the northeastern United States, I introduced the meditation we just did of bringing to mind your own field of spiritual figures, if you wished. That is, you could bring to mind your own field of spiritual figures, or you could bring to mind someone that you're grateful to in your life. Afterwards, during the question and answer period, a young woman stood up who was a Native American, part of a Native American, what used to be called an Indian tribe in the northeastern United States, who was a PhD student at that university. And she said, "I want to thank you for the practice we just did. This is the first time that I felt my ancestors were welcome at this university." So, thank you for your attention. So, so that was the third target group, right? People of other spiritual traditions. We have a little time remaining. I mean, the the session is scheduled to go actually till 7:15. There is some time then for questions and responses, and also I'd really invite also what this raises for you may raise certain thoughts or ideas as well as questions. So please feel free. Okay, so maybe first here, and what do we do? Just speak loudly? Okay.
I can certainly speak loudly.
And I can, okay.
So thank you, John, as usual, for your care and precision and everything. It's so helpful.
Thank you.
And you enumerated that there is a number of problems with empathy, but that you were just focusing on two.
Yeah.
Bias and empathic distress.
Yeah.
But there's one that I've come across in myself and in others, and oftentimes it happens. I mean, I have kind of very leftist political commitments.
Yeah.
So I've observed this in that tribe.
Yeah.
And it's a certain kind of violence that comes from empathy itself, which is to say, like being very sure that our way of empathizing is the correct way.
Yeah.
Being very sure that we can imagine the suffering of other people whose experience may be quite different
Yeah.
from ours.
Yeah.
So this kind of violence of empathic projection.
Right. Good.
I think it's
Yeah.
very difficult to develop awareness of.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at least the two problems that, I mean, the second problem that you outlined, empathic distress, I think is kind of helpful because it always, like that breaking point lets me see the limitations of my empathy. What about these empathic problems that are kind of harder nuts to crack?
Good. That's a great question. Thanks for raising that. So could everyone hear Shireen? You could? Yeah, I'm looking for the back row. You could basically hear her? Yeah. So this great. Thanks for raising that, and I probably should include that in the next time I present this kind of stuff. For the problem of empathic projection, maybe there are two basic things I want to say. One is, I don't want us to be so afraid of empathic projection, that is, that we think we know what others are experiencing, but actually we're in such a different social location or context that we're largely out of touch with what they're experiencing. So then that's empathic projection, but then, so we think we're empathizing, but we're not really in touch with what they're feeling. And so we could become so afraid of the problem of empathic projection. And I just raised this first, Shireen, because I come from, the United States, and man, after giving a talk like this or whatever, there's intense, fiery reaction of, no, empathic projection is the issue here. And and this becomes actually an argument against empathy almost. And of course, I don't think that's really what people mean who are concerned about empathic projection. They don't want all of us to stop trying to empathize. So what's needed? We have to learn from them what they're experiencing, and that can take many forms. The best forms being ones in which we come to know them, in relationship, and there's no way around it. Learning from them how it feels to be in the position that they're in. But there are many other things that help that, including literature, and the role of fiction here is enormous. As a lot of fiction is not just fiction, and not just fiction, but also nonfiction, of course. Theater, the arts, this is part of their enormous importance. So this third problem of empathic projection requires learning from others what they're experiencing. There's no way around it. I don't think we can learn that just from meditation, but that can really inform our meditation. That sometimes this question is raised with such fire, which is not how you raised it at all, but back where I come from, that it almost becomes another argument against empathy. But that's not what people want who are suffering. Don't even try to empathize with us. Don't even try to understand what we're feeling. That's not what they're seeking. So you have to be very careful about that. But then once we've also been learning from others how they feel, then how do we cultivate a power of care and love and compassion that can be much more sustaining can be replenishing. We can reconnect with the source of this love and compassion when we need to, when we become depleted, can become more inclusive. How do we do that? And that's not well known. So now it kicks in. But thanks for that question. And then other issues that are raised for you, Julia?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Very interesting this reading. I have worked with similar material on compassion. Also came to the conclusion that yes, we cannot look at compassion training in terms of these techniques. That doesn't make any sense if you look at Buddhist literature. I was thinking of it in terms of compassion culture.
Yeah.
There within which certain techniques make sense.
Yeah, I love that term, compassion culture. Yeah.
And what was new for me was this approach that you take with Shantideva.
Mm.
Within the compassion culture, I was thinking of seeing in Buddhist literature different ways of approaching compassion. One is that I call a constructive way, and then a deconstructive way, and an analytical way.
Oh,
And I was seeing the constructive way where you build up emotion and empathy, what we see in Lojong, with
yeah.
focus on the mother or a loving person.
Mm-hmm.
But I also saw limitations with that, just like you pointed out.
Yeah.
When it's an emotion, emotions are temporal, they can go away, you can have a bad day. So
Yeah.
I was seeing then Shantideva coming with a deconstructive approach, meaning taking away what hinders us from being.
Right, right.
And therefore coming actually with a rational approach, or let's say an approach that doesn't emphasize empathy. But what you brought up, how he develops actually emotional field by the first chapter where we
Right.
become part of the Buddha family.
Yeah.
I never thought about that, and it's really interesting.
But see, that's my complaint with Buddhist studies and religious studies, is that that's the foundation of all the other possibilities. The first 3 chapters establish the basis in refuge, which is also beginning to establish the inner secure base from which to make the commitment of a bodhisattva. I mean, think about it. I vow to become fully enlightened in order to help liberate all beings, and will never leave samsara until all beings are liberated. Who can take that vow? I would argue, and Shantideva demonstrates it in the first 3 chapters, as obviously, but it's across all Mahayana literature. No one can take that vow unless their understanding is that they are becoming an extension of what has already happened. And I hardly even see that in the commentaries upon this or in the readings of Shantideva, that established the foundation for everything else that's going to happen in the text. Then chapters 6, 7, 8 are deconstructing the ways that our habitual patterns have worked and reconstructing things into what might be considered a tremendous extension of what we consider to be the self, to include all the other beings. But I do see empathy coming into his chapter 8. I mean, after all, he exchanges self with other and starts to see and feel, as it's not just intellectual, feeling what it would feel like to be in their position. He's describing that in the last section of chapter 8. Then, of course, chapter 9 becomes a deep dive into wisdom, into the empty nature.
But when he describes the feeling part in chapter 8, is actually more the uncomfortable feeling of having others look at you with jealousy and envy and so on.
But in my reading of that chapter, you are those others. You become the other who's looking at you. You're not just thinking about them, but you are exchanging yourself with them and looking at yourself with their whole feeling about you. That's what I'm talking about, and that's pretty deep empathy.
Yes. Nevertheless, I see it differently than this kind of the loving feeling that is opening your heart. It is more showing the downsides of having this in-group, out-group bias.
So I would suggest that we read chapter 8 together with the first 3 chapters. and see what it is that he is seeking to become, which is what he is held in the first 3 chapters. And chapter 8 and chapter 9 are aiming to make him part of the field of refuge with all the qualities that he's described in the first 3 chapters to become an extension of what they are. And we have to read, I would argue, all the rest of the chapters, including 8 and 9, with that understanding, which I think was his understanding. Other issues? There's one back there. Yes? Yeah, so I'll talk about that more tomorrow. So thanks for raising that. Starting tomorrow, we're going to dive much more deeply into the practice side of all this. And there are all kinds of things like that that typically will come up. I would even say virtually always there will be something that comes up that's a problem when we try to do this kind of practice. And there are reasons why there will be internal obstacles. It sounds very nice what I described. And then I gave a sort of one way of beginning to enter into it. And whatever way I may give, there will be some problems that come up. But tomorrow we'll really get into that. What is that about? So another person might say, well, it sounded really good, but I just found myself thinking about other things the whole time. Or someone else will say, I just really felt like I shouldn't be doing this, that I'm not supposed to be receiving love, I'm supposed to be giving love and care to others. This feels wrong. Or someone else will say something else. You see what I mean? So it's almost automatic, things like that will come up. So we'll talk about that tomorrow, a little bit about why I think that happens. That also brings in some social psychology as well as Buddhist thought. But very quickly to your response, you notice I try to be really delicate with the instruction. Just if you wish, you could also think about people who held him in that way, because that begins to replicate the sense of a spiritual field. But you don't have to do that. But there's actually something probably more underlying the felt need that you experience to have to think about all that. So I want to talk about that tomorrow, okay? Others? Yeah, there? Yeah, I don't think it's hard, actually. I think Milarepa can help us. So in one of his songs, he sang that it may appear that I'm alone here in my cave, but actually all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are here with me, and all beings are here in this cave with me. We can experience that felt presence anytime. And the leaving a community that's caught up in klesha in order to put all of one's attention on becoming free of klesha, free of deluded emotion, causes of suffering, by linking up in a very focused way for the time being on the field of those who have become freed from klesha, from deluded emotion. So you're choosing to leave behind for the time being, from a Mahayana perspective. I'm really talking Mahayana Buddhism here. Ultimately, you're not going to leave sentient beings behind from a Mahayana or Bodhisattva Buddhist perspective. The whole aim of your practice is to never leave sentient beings alone in their suffering ever again. You'll always be present to them in the nature of their minds and in your enlightened activity. For the time being, you need to leave behind a world caught up in klesha and causes of suffering in order to put all of your attention on being held and supported and going for refuge in and becoming a part of a field of refuge for that world. And then you come back to that world. Or you become a powerful figure like Milarepa, whose power of enlightenment is such that the world comes to him. Does that begin to respond to your question? It's like that. That's why it can be important to leave behind. It's also not the only way. There's a whole variety of ways of being a practitioner, including town yogi, layperson, that's a serious bodhisattva practitioner, not watered down, perhaps also quite challenged by staying in that world that's caught up so much in causes of suffering, but trying to focus their attention very deeply on ways of freedom while staying in that world. That's also exemplified very much in the history of Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. And of course, the obvious text that's often raised up is the Vimalakirti Sutra that spoke a lot about that. Yeah. Okay, and then there was some in the back there, yeah. Yeah, these are good questions. So first with CBCT, that's cognitive-based compassion therapy, which came out of Geshe Losang Gyegi at Emory University. It's very closely correlated. I mean, there's also very prominent compassion cultivation training, CCT, that came out of Stanford University with Jimpa's program. Julia's familiar with all these programs here. They're all very mutually, what do you call it, supportive, or what's the word I'm looking for? They're, sorry? Yeah, complementary. But they have different emphases. And the Sustainable Compassion Training program that I'm talking about puts a real emphasis, a real foundational emphasis on a relational field of love and care and compassion as the starting point. Now, that's not always easy for everybody to access, but there are many ways to access it, many kinds of access points. And that kind of real focus on that as foundational, I think, is distinctive of ours. Another feature of it is an emphasis on the innate, which means that each of the practices is understood and engaged as a practice of a kind of receptivity rather than an attempt at effortful doing, although it does require some, obviously it requires discipline and we are doing something, but what we're doing is learning to become more receptive to innate capacities that are actually already here now, available right now, but are being impeded right now by patterns of the mind. So that's a tremendous emphasis on the innateness, and that's coming particularly from the traditions of Buddhism that I draw from, which is mainly Nyingma and Kagyu. The second question, of course, that's a huge question, but it comes back to, do we just learn these things and perhaps we begin to have some experience of them, and then that's for Buddhists, or only for people who are interested in converting to a religion called Buddhism? I mean, is that the Bodhisattva commitment? So it just doesn't feel to me like a Bodhisattva commitment. This obviously has to also relate to the wider world. And of course, many people are practicing and then they're participating in the wider world, empowered by their practice to participate in that wider world, the world, in really beneficial ways that are sometimes quite profound and amazing, And I think that's crucial. That's the heart of the Bodhisattva way in our world. I think Chögyam Rinpoche in his own way is really promoting that, as well as everything else, including monastic learning, at the very heart of everything. There's no easy one answer to your question. I think what I try to do to personalize it a little bit is I'm often in spaces, and other people who teach with me this kind of practice direction are in contexts and spaces where two or all three of the groups I mentioned are in the room. And most of the people in the room by far are not Buddhist. All I can do is give you my personal response. So I make it clear that the primary tradition I'm drawing from is indeed Tibetan Buddhism, and that we have adapted those practices. Anyone who has an interest in really exploring further into the depth of where this is coming from, which not everyone is. Often there might be a Catholic or a Jew in the room, which is very common. who find that this is really opening for them back into their own spirituality, and sometimes in a really profound way. And I think that's really fantastic and important. Buddhism is just not for everybody. You have no substantial self. That is not for everybody. So then I make it clear that I have teachers. And if you want to go into fuller depth into the Tibetan ground of all this, then I connect them to that. And a number of them show up and become connected to Chikanima or Sogni Rinpoches. But I don't impose that on anybody. That's just a natural process. Does that help begin to address your question? So I'm not requiring that the room be Buddhist. I'm not hiding the fact that I'm drawing from Buddhism, and I'm trying to make myself transparent to the fact that I'm an extension of something. It doesn't begin and end with me, and somehow that could be porous enough that people can find their way. One difference, we're just about finishing up here. One difference, also this is another distinction of the Sustainable Compassion Training Program. So again, the different programs I think are profoundly complementary and really deep because they're drawing on Lojong. And that's just totally profound. And they've made it into a form that could be accessed by anyone from any background. Now most of the workshops, places where people would be taught techniques or methods for cultivating capacities, including mindfulness or compassion. Now, compassion's much newer to bring that into a secular world. But in the vast majority of those spaces, I mean, almost all of them, the secular space that's constructed has been called by a close colleague of mine, a closed secular space, meaning that you leave behind, when you enter that workshop, you leave behind at the door your own religious or spiritual background if you have one. That's not to be discussed. We have a secular space here where science and some basic, of course there's some things adapted from Buddhism, but they're adapted into a form that are considered to be universally accessible. And we won't bring in our spiritual or religious background, and that makes a safe space. Is that clear? And then, of course, research scientists don't want to hear about religion for the most part. It just makes everything fraught. Everybody's just going to be fighting over their religious, metaphysical beliefs. So that's been the basic way. Sustainable compassion training is trying to hold all three of those target groups. And that means the kind of secular space that we construct is different. It's been called by one of my colleagues an open secular space, meaning that we provide a kind of a pattern of practice exemplified by what I just did. That was only one little example of a meditation exercise, one way of finding some access. There are many other ways. But we provide ways of finding access following a certain pattern drawn from Tibetan Buddhism, and that same pattern can be found in the other traditions. And then we invite those who are there to bring their background, whatever it is. Bring your spiritual background, your religious worldview, and fill in that pattern with your own worldview. If you're a research scientist, bring attachment theory, social baseline theory, neuroscience. Bring your worldview into this pattern to understand what you're doing and motivate you. If you're a Native American, bring your ancestors. Okay, I think we're actually at the end of our time, so thank you all so much. And then just a reminder, so Tuesday through Friday, we'll be going really into practice and theory right through it. And there will be a handout with the meditation practices for those who come. And I'll try to show up at lunch each day at noon. Is noon when lunch is here? 12:30. So I'll try to show up at 12:30 in case there's anybody who just wants to chat. Okay, thank you all.